Before we begin, we're going to hear an introduction from Wendy Fibison, vestry member. Forward, Wendy.
Good morning. Welcome to St. John's Fireside Chat with our guest, Dr. Anthony Fauci, and our rector, Reverend Rob Fisher. Dr. Fauci exemplifies true leadership. He served as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the second largest institute at NIH, for 38 years. During this time, his budget went from millions to billions, based on his proven leadership in medicine, research, and public health, and his ability to communicate complicated science information and issues. Dr. Fauci has had a significant impact on our understanding of infectious diseases, such as tuberculosis, malaria, Ebola, SARS, as a few examples. He has advised 7 presidents and published over 1,000 papers. Dr. Fauci has also always connected with individuals. He is a great listener. In the early days of HIV/AIDS, activists were demonstrating against the government's approach because they perceived that it was not sensitive to the impact AIDS was having on their population. Everyone was saying about the demonstrators, arrest them, put them in jail. Dr. Fauci was the one scientist that said, no, bring them into my office and let's talk about it. His listening, combined with his scientific expertise and his public health focus, had a major impact on what followed in the ensuing years. One outcome was PEPFAR, an AIDS program that has saved more than 20 million lives throughout the developing world. Dr. Fauci was one of its principal architects. Dr. Fauci combines extraordinary expertise with an exceptional ability to communicate with ordinary people so that the non-scientist can understand the implications of science for personal and public health. Most recently, he has been recognized for his COVID leadership. He was the principal White House advisor for 2 administrations, and he spent countless hours over many months communicating with the public. Dr. Fauci is married to Dr. Christine Grady, who is the chief of the Department of Bioethics at the NIH Clinical Center, and they have 3 daughters. How else is Dr. Fauci known? Many refer to him as my hero, Americans' doctor, our national treasure. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Thank you all for being with us today, and thank you, Dr. Fauci, for being with us. We are honored. I know you've just retired, and it's very special that you agreed to come so soon and to be here for this. It was his idea that we do a fireside chat, and I think it's a great idea, and I'm honored to be able to have this conversation with you. And I want to say thank you for your service, all of the years that you have served our country and actually served the world. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
So I actually want to start with a very difficult question. The hard question is close to the hearts of many of us, and I know this is very hard to predict, but when do you think the Washington Nationals are going to be competitive again?
Well, if you read the sports section today of the Washington Post, the manager said that he's going to look upon this year as more than just a building year, that he's going to really try to win every day. Every day he walks in, it's going to be 1-0. So he's a great manager. I think we're going to do well. I don't think we're going to get to the World Series, but I think we'll do fine.
That gives me comfort.
Pray for them.
Actually, that does segue into my real first question. I understand that growing up you loved sports. I know that you grew up in Brooklyn, and I spent 2 formative years of my life in that borough. I have a great reverence for New York City and for Brooklyn especially. I actually worked at a hospital as a hospital chaplain during that time. And I would love for you to share a little bit about what your upbringing was like. What did you experience as a child, and how did that influence the life that you have led?
Well, I think the early years, my formative years, really did play a major role in the foundation for where I am now and where I've been for the last 50 years that I've been in public service. I was born and raised in, for any of you who have been to New York, in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn. And the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, it isn't that way now, but if you do an aerial map of Brooklyn and you look at all the different sections, it was almost precisely segmented into ethnic backgrounds. So Bensonhurst was 99.4% Italian American. And then you go across 18th Avenue into Borough Park, and it's 99.5% Jewish. And then you go down this way, it's Puerto Rican, and it's African American. So it was, a neighborhood approach. And the neighborhood approach back then was the idea about people taking care of each other and caring for each other, because almost all of them came from the same immigrant background, where either their grandparents or their parents were born, usually in Italy, came over through Ellis Island, and had a feeling of community. So that's when from the time that I can remember, it was always people taking care of each other. My parents, thank goodness, but it's true, had the orientation of being very conscious of the need to give back to society. And I'm not quite sure where that came from, possibly from that spirit of immigrants, which is that you're in America and you have a great opportunity and you want to pay back. So from the time I can remember, when I was a child, my father, who was a pharmacist, always felt that service for others and not financial gain was the most important thing. And that was sort of my birth until elementary school and high school. And then I had the fortune of going to schools that had that as their theme, service for others. I went to, so I have a Italian-American Catholic background, so I went to Our Lady of Guadalupe Elementary School in Brooklyn, where the Dominican nuns also were very much about your obligation to the community. And then I went to Regis High School, which is a Jesuit high school in Manhattan, which was the same theme, which has gone through. And that kind of prepped me for my feeling that I wanted to serve the public. And it, like I said, it goes right from the time that I was born in that neighborhood, which was a very caring neighborhood. So I think Brooklyn, for me, and the neighborhood ethnic element of my growing up really did play an important role. I didn't know as it was happening. Only retrospectively now, when you think about it, you realize what impact that had.
So thinking about your career, I know you trained to be a physician, and most physicians, most doctors work with patients, and you're working to heal a body, usually one at a time. You have a patient, you can sit across from them, you can talk with them, ask them questions. But as your career evolved, you became the public health doctor that you became, really a doctor not to individual bodies, but to whole populations, which I think is fascinating. You can't just ask a whole population, how are you feeling today, and what can I do for you, and why aren't you taking your pills, for example. How's that transition been experienced for you?
A great question, and it really was an evolution, a process that evolved. So when I went to medical school and I did my internship and residency training in internal medicine, unquestionably my goal was to finish my multiple years of residency training, take a fellowship. I was interested in infectious diseases and immunology, and then spend my entire career doing what you said a moment ago, taking care of the individual patient. And even to this day, my primary identity is one of a physician as opposed to a public health person, even though I'm better known internationally as a public health person. But what happened was a series of circumstances that I didn't predict, which is one of the lessons I tell younger people. Expect the unexpected, because things are going to get thrown in front of you that you can't predict. That when I finished my internal medicine training, very focused on the individual patient, I took a 3-year fellowship right here in Bethesda at the NIH in infectious disease, and I was introduced into the world of discovery and research, which has the effect of what you are doing. If you make a contribution to further knowledge in a field, you automatically have an impact not only on the individual patient that you're taking care of, which I continue to take care of, but you may make a discovery, which we did make, fortunately, publish it in the literature, and have other physicians, not only in this country, but throughout the world, use the information that you gathered to essentially treat many more patients that you might not ever see. So I went from the individual patient to research, and then something else happened. When I became the director of NIAID, that introduced me to the policies, as was mentioned by Wendy in the introduction, that involve things well beyond my own individual research interest. HIV, TB, malaria, tropical diseases, influenza, childhood diseases, so that's when I graduated into the next level of what I was doing, as I've done with COVID and as I've done with HIV. Not only goes from the individual patient to a large group of patients, but to global policy. So it was a process that evolved that when I was in medical school, I never would have predicted that that's where I would be. I would have thought that I would be in New York City on 2nd Avenue and 69th Street seeing patients, which it would have been nice, but that's not where I wound up.
Could you imagine what a different life? As you speak, it makes me think about one of the ways that the way you've served has, I think, touched a lot of us. I think I can speak for myself, and I bet a lot of us here. During that time where we all just didn't know what to do, what to think, there was so much totally unprecedented that so many of us were totally unprepared for to even think about. Your voice was one of the voices that we heard, and doing what you were doing at the NIH, they probably didn't expect you to have a great bedside manner, but I think you had a great bedside manner for us all. And we needed to hear a physician talking to us when we were in a place of great vulnerability collectively. So I just thank you for that.
Yeah. Right. Thank you.
And I will admit, I kind of realized that when I rewatched. I'd forgotten that this exists, but in addition to the many other great distinguished things in your career, Brad Pitt played you, famously. And actually, Brad Pitt got an Emmy for depicting you, which an Emmy nomination. I'm sorry, an Emmy nomination. But in his talk, he made that point that that was helpful. I think it was back in April of 2020, so it was early on.
Right.
So I think too about what you've had to do. I know that you've advised 7 presidents, and I'm not going to ask who your favorites were. But I know that you have had, speaking of bedside manner, you've had the difficult situation of having to tell very powerful people very unpleasant news. What has that been like?
Well, it is the only way to go. I've told this story often, but I think it's really relevant to the question you're asking, is that the first president that I dealt with where I had to go into the White House and advise them on some questions they were asking was Ronald Reagan. And I was very young at the time and inexperienced. I had never spoken in person or been even in the same room with a president. And a very dear friend of mine who had the opportunity years earlier of serving in the Nixon White House. And I would have hoped that I came to this conclusion on my own, but his words cemented it for me. And what he told me, he said, when you're going into the White House and you're going into the West Wing, in that awning that goes into the lower level of the West Wing, just tell yourself that this might be the last time I'm walking into this building because I might have to tell the president something that he or she may not want to hear. And one of the things about the White House is it's very seductive. It's a historic place, very similar to what this building is. And when you go in, you have a natural instinct that you want to get asked back. And one of the problems people have is they may wind up being hesitant to tell a president an inconvenient truth. So I did that, and I had to tell President Reagan something that was an inconvenient truth, that I didn't think we were doing enough for HIV because it was the very early years in the 80s. And what happened is that instead of the messenger getting shot, he respected me for, he didn't necessarily agree with me, but he respected me for the fact that I told him what I thought was actually the truth. And that continued with George H.W. Bush, with Clinton, with George W. Bush, with Obama, and right down the line. And after a while, you get a reputation that you are going to tell what the truth is, even if it's inconvenient for people. And that really worked very well, with one exception. Right.
No follow-up question on that. So, as a physician who is a physician of individuals as well as of larger bodies of people, and as a person who is famously very healthy, and your stamina has been remarkable for all these years. You look younger than I am, to me. So, deep question: how would you define wellness?
That's a good question, because wellness, I think, is a combination of physical, emotional, and spiritual wellness. I mean, you could be the best athlete in the world and be racked with insecurity or with doubts about things, and I don't think you'd be well. Or you could be someone who is at peace from an emotional and spiritual standpoint, and unfortunately are ravaged with physical disease. So I think wellness is a combination of all. And it's true that at any given time in your life, you're not going to be completely well. I mean, so to me, wellness is as close to a balance of all of those things as you possibly could have. To be at peace with yourself emotionally, mentally, but also to try and stay as physically healthy as you possibly can. Sometimes that's out of your control because illnesses occur. But there are things that you can do to either prevent the unnecessary occurrence of illness by avoiding things that clearly lead to illnesses, as well as just common practices of trying to stay healthy, as well as paying attention to your mental and emotional health also. So,
thank you for that. So for your own practices to sustain you, I'm sure what you've done has been draining at times, exhausting. You've had to be incredibly patient. What do you do to keep yourself going? How do you recharge your batteries, and what do you like to do for fun?
Fun. I've always been a physical person, an athlete when I was in high school and beyond, a marathon runner and a 10K runner. So physical activity, particularly running, I ran a fair amount until just a few years ago, where I now just power walk. But physical activity is one. But the other one is sitting right there in the first pew. It's very important to have somebody that you can be very honest about how you feel, who can sense when you're in a stressful situation, and who knows through experience of how to decompress that stressful situation. I think if I had to do it alone with no support system, that really would be very difficult, because there were some times, not only in COVID, there were times, some of you may remember, the incredible stress after 9/11 when the anthrax attacks occurred, because we didn't know whether that was Al-Qaeda that was going to hit us again in the DC Metro subway system the next day. So that was really quite tense. The early years of HIV, when almost all of my patients died, and I took personal care of these people. It wasn't that I was abstract away from them. And then the 3 very, very, very stressful years that we've had with COVID, where we've lost 1.1 million Americans have died. I mean, that is something that you feel, almost personally, because you're very much involved in it. So like I said, the stress is having a support system, family or friends, as well as being able to do things physically that sort of decompress that stress and strain.
Are you enjoying retirement?
Well, if it isn't retirement. That's so when I find it somewhat amusing when they ask me the same question, because they think when you step down from a job that, I wake up, I play golf and have a martini in the afternoon, and that's not what's going on. So what I did is I didn't listen to the advice of my friends and my wife, which was when you step down from the government, you should just sort of take 3 or 4 weeks or a month off and just think about what you're going to do. What I did, probably not wisely, was to make commitments to do things through January, February, March, and April before I even decided to step down. So when I stepped down from the government, literally the next day, I was on a trip giving a talk somewhere. So I haven't yet reached the point of slowing down, but hopefully I will do that. Hopefully.
So looking back to the last 3 years, if you could go back and do anything over again, what would you do differently?
Well, that question leads to an explanation of what the evolution of scientific knowledge means. If you're in a static situation and you make a decision about something, and it is maybe not the optimal decision, you need to go back and say, well, I had all the information I needed. Why didn't I make the right decision? When we were in the early months of January 2020, turned the clock back, we weren't dealing with a static situation. We were dealing with a rapidly evolving situation and a rapidly evolving sequence of awarenesses that we didn't have before. For example, very quickly, in the beginning, it was thought, probably through misinformation or withheld information on the part of the Chinese, that this virus spread from an animal to a human, but very, very inefficiently went from human to human, similar to the earlier coronavirus that we saw in 2002. As the weeks went by, we found out, no, it actually spreads very efficiently from human to human. And then a week and a half, 2 weeks later, in the middle and end of January, it is one of the most easily spread viruses we've ever seen. Then another week goes by, and this had to do with whether or not we recommended wearing masks or not, is that it wasn't droplet spread the way influenza, where if you're sitting next to somebody and they're sneezing and coughing, you're going to get infected. It was aerosol spread, merely by breathing, not necessarily coughing. And then the real showstopper was the realization that 50 to 60% of the transmissions occurred from someone who had no symptoms, which was completely unprecedented in the history of respiratory diseases. So what we knew in January, you're asking me, would I have done something different? Boy, if I knew in January, what I knew in July, we would have done a lot of things differently. Now, one of the troubles is that what the general public interpreted understandably was, well, the scientists are flip-flopping. One day they say you don't need to wear a mask, and then a month later they say you should really need to wear a mask. It really isn't flip-flopping. It is using the information that you have at a given time to make a recommendation. So, I tend, when I explain it to audiences, it's like in January of 2020, 2 plus 2 equaled 4. In March of 2023, 2 plus 2 still equals 4. In January of 2020, the COVID virus was very different than the COVID virus in 2023, Because Omicron is very different from the original virus in so many different ways. We've had multiple different variants, so it has been a real moving target. And what the public expects, understandably, is a mathematical precision to a biological problem. And it doesn't work that way. And that's the reason why 2 + 2 will always be 4. But the virus is going to continue to change right before our very eyes.
That's interesting. It's such a misnomer. We talk about the virus as if it's a one thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. One question that I think probably nobody knows the answer to, but I'd love your thoughts about it. I think about what we've been through, not just the physical, medical aspect of it, but the social aspect of how I never would have imagined that things that got politicized could possibly be politicized. I think about, like, what if we politicized wearing Band-Aids, for example? Why would we do something like that? But it's happened before our eyes. I made a prediction. I turned out to be very wrong when things were, building. I said, well, you can't gaslight a virus. You can't gaslight a pandemic. You can, actually, gaslight even a pandemic. And we have a crisis. I don't think so much, it's not a crisis of epidemiology, but of epistemology. Where do people get their truth? Where do people put their trust? And right now, in such polarized times, this is a major problem for us because I think we're very ill prepared for the next pandemic. What would your wish be? How do we get more well as a society? How do we become whole again so that we can be like the experiences of community that you described that formed you, which I still believe in. I haven't given up that hope, but I don't see it coming that soon. The Nationals might actually have a good year before we get there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the pandemic has cast a very, very bright light on a lesion that had been growing for quite a while in society that has now been absolutely focused on by the pandemic. So let me explain what I mean. In society, I am, and I've said it, a completely apolitical person. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I don't get involved in political things because I've focused essentially on science. So to have differences in ideology, to me, is very, very healthy. You could have your far progressives, you could have your left of center, you could have your center, you're a little bit right to center, and your arch conservatives, which is good because it reflects the heterogeneity in society. However, when that becomes extremely divisive, where there isn't the range, it's this, which is what happened, that we have such a divisiveness in society that if ever there was a time in history when divisiveness was beyond counterproductive, is when you're trying to fight a historic pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen in over 100 years since the influenza pandemic of 1918. It could not possibly have been a worse time to see profound divisiveness. So when you ask, how do we heal? I hope that there's a sense in the community. I'm a cautious optimist about this. I have faith in the better angels of people, maybe a little bit too much of that. But I would hope that we look upon this as there has to be lessons learned. If anybody who puts aside the strong ideological differences and say, what went wrong here? What went wrong is that we had a common enemy, and the common enemy was the virus, and we were fighting with each other. That's exactly what happened. It's almost analogous to saying that we're in the middle of World War II, and the Army is fighting with the Navy instead of fighting with the common enemy. It was very, very much like that. So perhaps when the dust settles a bit and we get COVID that goes really even further down than it is now, and we ask ourselves a question of how can we prepare for the next inevitable pandemic, and there will be one. I've spent 40 years lecturing about emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, And people would ask me what my worst nightmare was, and my worst nightmare was the evolution of a brand new virus that was respiratory spread that would kill a lot of people, and now we're living through it. So it's going to happen again. It may not happen in our lifetime, but it is going to happen again. So we really need to use the lessons that we've learned to not only prepare us for a pandemic, but to bring out to us the folly of profound divisiveness in society.
Well, thank you for that. We're now going to open this up for some questions, and Clark Irvin, who runs our speaker series, is going to field the questions, and after about 15 minutes of questions, we're going to have a little surprise at the very end, so stay ready for that. Clark, I'm going to give you my microphone.
Sure. All right, questions, please. Keep them short, make sure it's a question, and one question, please, so we can get in as many as possible. Martha.
Well, the one thing, that's a great question. And it really relates to what we scientifically know as a fact, despite the misinformation, that vaccinated people compared to unvaccinated people, there's a multi-fold greater chance of an unvaccinated person, if they get infected, getting a severe outcome with hospitalization and death. Now we're also learning that vaccinated and up-to-date boosted, there's a big difference, 3 to 4-fold, between someone who's vaccinated and not boosted. So the idea of not getting vaccinated and not updating your booster scientifically is a slam dunk. No matter what some governors or other people say, it's a slam dunk. So the one thing we do know, that regardless of all the misinformation, that particularly if you're vulnerable, and vulnerable means age. You know, I'm vulnerable because of my age. I happen to be healthy, thank goodness, but I'm still quite vulnerable. So that's the one thing. I could give you 3 or 4, but I want to stay short with the question. But that's a very good question, because you have to go with the science. And the science is crystal clear on this. Not maybe, crystal clear.
Tony. Just for those in the back, have what we learned, is that set us up better for the next pandemic?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, there are so many things. Now, I have a lecture that I gave the other day where there were 10 different lessons that we've learned. And, you know, and one of them I think you were alluding to when you said the pharmaceutical is that the investments that were made in basic and clinical biomedical research for the 2 decades or so that antedated COVID allowed us to do something that is unprecedented in the history of medicine, to go from a brand new virus that we recognized its sequence genomically on the 10th of January of 2020 to a vaccine that was shown to be safe and 95% effective in 11 months. The record before then was 7 years, and we did it in 11 months. And that's the lesson. Don't be afraid to make major investments in basic and clinical research and take a chance the way we did with Operation Warp Speed in putting billions of dollars in. That's one of maybe 10 separate lessons we've learned.
Somebody over here? Right there.
What have you learned about delivering inconvenient truths in a way where you can disagree productively?
What have you learned about sharing inconvenient truths so you can learn productively?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of things. First of all, sticking with the science and the data are very, very clear. And when you're telling someone that's an inconvenient truth, you do it in a way that is totally non-confrontative and make sure you don't have the person feel that they're wrong or they're stupid or they didn't understand what was going on. You just have to be completely open, honest, but be flexible. I mean, when I had to tell, I'm just getting back and just think about during the anthrax attacks, when we were trying to get people to understand that it would not be a good idea to all of a sudden vaccinate the whole country against smallpox, even though there were some really, really good people in the government at the very highest level who felt the only way we're going to protect the country is vaccinated. And I felt that the risk of a toxicity of a vaccine that's good but has a lot of adverse events would really be a bad idea. If you walked in and said, Mr. Vice President or Mr. President, this is a stupid idea, you're not going to go anywhere. But if you explain scientifically and do it in a respectful way, it really works. It really works.
Wandy.
So I'm a mid-career physician, and I was wondering, do you think, and I look at how much healthcare costs in America, do you think we're going to start testing for respiratory viruses just empirically, or do you think at some point testing will stop and it'll just be if we have like a population surge?
Will we start testing?
No, I don't think testing is going to be the answer. What I do think is that what we're learning now with the technologies we have, that we used to think that the array of respiratory viruses was beyond our ability to make vaccines against them. I think we're going to have, like, for example, respiratory syncytial virus. We now have a vaccine that is going to be readily available soon, and that's one of the major morbidity-inducing viruses for young children and for the elderly. So I don't think we're going to be testing everybody multiple different times. I don't think that's going to be the answer, but I think a greater acceptance of vaccines for respiratory diseases. Having said that, I get an ache in my chest because I know that we're evolving into an anti-vax era where the idea of pushing back on COVID vaccines is spilling over into people not wanting to have childhood vaccines for children getting into school, which would be a gigantic step backwards if we did that. Because every country that's done that has had outbreaks of measles and mumps and rubella and other diseases.
I think we've got time for 2 other questions if they're quick. Right there. When will the book be out?
As soon as I write it.
Okay. We've got time for one more question then. I think you had your hand up, pal.
Gain of function has got a lot of publicity politically in the last couple of years. Why is it important, particularly in vaccine research?
See, gain of function has been misused because it means one thing for one person and another thing for another. And that's the reason why years ago we clarified what the guide rails of experiments that can be done that might have the effect of increasing the pathogenicity or the transmissibility of a pathogen that could cause disease. But that is a very small fraction of gain of function. And when you hear people saying we're going to ban all gain of function research, if you do, we're not going to have any vaccines. Because, for example, the influenza vaccine that we all got was made in eggs in which the virus was grown in eggs in order to have enough virus to kill it to make it into a vaccine. The only way you do that is you change the virus to make it adaptable to eggs so that it grows efficiently enough to get enough product to make a vaccine. That's gain of function. That is very different from taking a pathogen of known morbidity and mortality and for one reason or other, potentially good reason, to make it more pathogenic or more transmissible. And yet the general public groups all of them together. And when you say gain of function is bad or gain of function is good, gain of function is neither bad nor good. You have to look at what the situation that you're talking about right now. And that's one of the things that just every single day when you see someone getting up talking about gain of function, generally they don't know what they're talking about.
Final question, very quick. Riley, quick question.
Yes. Dr. Fauci, what happened
For those in the back, President Bush cited Dr. Fauci as a hero in 1988. Right.
Right. Well, the only thing that changed is that a lot of people said, "Who the hell is he?" No, seriously. I think that was the beginning of the realization that if you handle things properly, you could get involved in a productive way in policy. Because even though I knew Reagan and I had an extensive relationship with him, I advised him a few times, it was only when I developed a very strong friendship and relationship with George H.W. Bush before he became president. Because remember, when he called me his hero, it was during the presidential debate with Dukakis when they were asking who your hero was. And the very fact that he considered me a hero meant that I could develop a relationship with him that when he became president, I could have an influence. And the influence, Riley, as you well know, is that when he became president, the funding for HIV went way up. And it went way up because he listened to me that this is really a big problem. It's not a little problem, it's a big problem. And the other lesson I learned is a lesson that everybody in Washington should know. When in Washington, be nice to everybody, because you never know when they're going to end up being president.
Well, it's very nice of you to give up your brunch date or your golf tee time that you could be here with us. I appreciate that. And so we were talking yesterday. I was talking with one of your security team, and I realized that taking selfies with you is a thing. And we have too many people. We can't all take selfies, but I had the idea, well, maybe we could take a selfie with everyone behind us, and then you all get to be in a selfie with Dr. Fauci today. And, yeah, and because neither of us have very long arms, I've asked Kay Edwards to help us. I don't have a selfie stick. Okay, are you all ready? Okay, Kay? No, you can stand behind the altar. It's okay. Here, let's stand. Go ahead and stand. Yeah.
Are you getting the back, or should we go down a few steps?